Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
We live in a world in which science and the scientific world is convinced of a particular theory of the origin of our humankind through evolution from lower forms of life, and yet we have a Bible that talks about creation, that the world is created in 6 days and all the parts of it, and God rests on the seventh. And so even now I notice we are having a fight between people who hold evolution and the other who hold the creationist viewpoint. But I think really that Christians don't have to feel themselves in that bind, pulled between science and between religion. And again, I think the key is this notion of literary form.
Today, Father Bacik and Dr. Eugene Trester discuss literary form in the Bible. Here's Father Bacik.
Gene, I'm glad that we have the opportunity to talk about biblical matters. I know that's your field. You teach up at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto and teach in this area, and so I'm happy to have the chance to discuss that with you. And now one of the things that's impressed me most about your work is the way you have summarized much of the scholarship that is available in the area of biblical studies. I have found that personally very helpful. I've read through a big part of your work and have found it a fine refresher course for myself in bringing things up to date. And I think that many people also in following your program of biblical andragogy would find the same sort of thing. Now, I want to now try to get at some of the content of this biblical scholarship and the ways in which it seems to me it could help us to deal with religious questions better today, to understand the Scriptures better, and to get more out of them. Let's just take the obvious one to begin with, that's based on the notion of literary forms. I suppose back when I studied Scripture in the early 60s, that was one of the most enlightening things I ever learned, that the Bible is not just a dictated book, but that the human author has tremendous importance, that his own personality and psychology are built into the whole thing, and that the authors chose different types of literary forms, ways of speaking, in order to make their point. Here's something, I don't know if I first got this from Eugene Maley when I studied under years ago or where I picked it up, but I've used it ever since as a way of trying to get this idea across to people, and that is comparing it with reading the newspaper. Mm-hmm. So that if one reads the newspaper, you look at the front page and you expect that what is written there is true, it's factual. You read about earthquakes or floods or brush fires, and you think, yes, this is a report of what is going on. And then one turns to the editorial page, and as you read there, you shift gears. You think, I'm reading opinion here. This is somebody's outlook on the world scene. So they say, well, there's this battle between the superpowers, and the reason Russia is getting more armaments is such and such. And you either think yes or no or disagree with it, but you take it as opinion. And then as you're paging through the paper, you may well get to something like the ads. And as you're reading through, you see you just automatically filter in exaggeration. You say, well, yes, this ad says that if you use this hairspray, you will be irresistible. Well, you know you won't be irresistible. I mean, you know that ahead of time. Or when I read the ads and it says you buy this golf ball and it'll go 300 yards if you hit it, I know that that'll never happen, no matter how they build a golf ball. And then I was thinking, then you get to finally maybe to the comic page, and you read about Peanuts, and in there's this dog, Snoopy, and the dog is thinking, a thinking dog. And as you read that, you don't say to yourself, well, Schultz is flipped out, he's gone crazy, he thinks dogs think. You know that he's using that as a device in order to get some of his ideas across. So we know there that we have different literary forms, different ways of making a point or writing things. And the same thing goes with the Scriptures, so that you're going to find in the Scriptures certain things that rather resemble the front pages, like the stories about David and his court life and so on. Other times you're going to get exaggeration when you read the numbers of people that went out of Egypt in the Exodus, for example, or the ages to which the patriarchs lived. Other places we get poetic kind of commentary, as when in the Psalms, in describing the Exodus, it says that the sea fled as the Israelites were leaving Egypt. And so we get these various literary forms, and I think that maybe that's a simple way of trying to get that across to people. I mean, how do you approach that yourself, Gene, when you're trying to teach literary forms to people?
I think that's a beautiful illustration, Jim. The newspaper, we're quite familiar with that. What's important, I think, to us to keep in mind continuously is that we're dealing with oral and then ultimately written traditions. And initially, one might be a little bit fearful when one begins to see that there's contradictions in the text. The story is repeated 3 times. It's not quite certain what the name of the mountain is. It's got 2 names, or God himself is referred to by 2 names. But ultimately we find that a careful study to these literary forms, rather than being a problem, ultimately get to be keys that begin to open up to us a way of looking at how the Bible itself was formed, how the Tanakh, the Old Testament, was formed. And just in beginning to see how it's formed, I'm learning a tremendous amount about that revelation already, a very
what God is
helpful way.
saying to his people.
In various times. And we're looking at the giftedness or lack of giftedness of the authors. And as you're suggesting, we're having poetry, and my mind really should be set to be receiving poetry now. Hence the importance of moving into the history, of understanding those literary forms.
And getting into the mind of the author, in a sense.
Exactly.
Knowing what you're reading.
That's right.
No, being able to distinguish fact from poetic commentary, for example.
And as you suggest, if we were to move into that obvious area of Genesis, in a sense we've been thrown a curve. Like if we're not prepared to do what we're speaking about right now, when we begin with Genesis 1, we're working with some very heavily theologized material that in a sense is a preface. It's probably the last thing written. Mm-hmm. It's an introduction, and the literary vehicle makes it look as if it's so simple, but it's got the earmarks of being discussed and refined for centuries, and here it's placed right at the beginning. Right. And if I'm not prepared, I'm going to be thrown.
I was just thinking, Gina, one way people are thrown by that is in the modern world with the discovery of evolution and the sense that we have evolved from lower forms of life, something that is accepted in the scientific world. I was just listening to a Harvard professor talk about that recently, and was saying that really in the scientific world there is no doubt about the fact of evolution. There is some discussion about the mechanism of how that is carried out. And so what we live in a world in which science and the scientific world is convinced of a particular theory of the origin of our humankind through evolution from lower forms of life. And yet we have a Bible that talks about creation, that the world is created in 6 days and all the parts of it, and God rests on the 7th. And so even now I notice we are having a fight between people who hold evolution and the other who hold the creationist viewpoint. And there's a talk about, well, we must teach creationism in the school alongside of evolutionary theory. But I think really that Christians don't have to feel themselves in that bind, pulled between science and between religion, between what we're learning from careful observation and what we know by reading the Scriptures. I don't think we need to be pulled by that. And again, I think the key is this notion of literary form. So that the literary form involved in Genesis 1 to 11 that talks about Adam and Eve and the garden and Noah and the ark and all of that, it has a very legendary character to it. I know some people have called that religious prehistory, or what's the phrase today? I mean, how do you like to refer to it?
Well, that's a fine phrase.
Religious prehistory?
Yeah.
And in which the situation would be that the author is using legendary material and constructing stories in order to teach religious truths. I guess the key is to say that those chapters of Genesis are a distinct literary form. They are not science. They are not history. It's not passed on from the beginning, but is rather a late creation within Judaism, in which they're trying to reflect on the relationship between God and people, where they understand that the evil in the world results from the sin sinful character of human beings and particular sins that people have committed, and where God is good and gives a measure of hope in the midst of all of that sin. Well, once you see that, then it seems to me the problem dissolves. One can be a scientist and be a believing member of the Judeo-Christian tradition. That all we're getting in here is religious truth. Not all we're getting, but the most important thing, we're getting religious truth. And it's telling us what really counts. God is responsible for the world. He's behind it. And we don't need any artificial explanations then, like, well, one day and was really a geological period or anything. I think day meant from sun up to sundown. And the author is just portraying it that way.
In a sense, there's a real depth to the scientific world if we want to look at it that way. Like, Christians really have to recognize that it was a scientific world that jarred us into doing some really serious scholarship about, say, the first book of Genesis. We thought that we were dealing with a 19th, 20th century history there, that this was actually a picture of how creation came about. And then a hypothesis comes up that begins to get more and more serious and developed. It talks about evolution. And then just exactly what you're talking about, Jim, we get into a time of concordism. We try to say, well, perhaps a day in that author's mind meant so many hundreds of thousands of years. We tried to explain it that way for a while. We found that really isn't fair, once again, to the author. And it really was the scientific world that forced us into doing more and more research. Like, what kind of literary form is this? What are the authors saying at this point? And we begin ultimately to see that the authors have constructed an ingenious literary vehicle. And it's not so much the vehicle that is most important, it's the theological truths that vehicle is able to carry. In that particular form, where we talk about 6 days, we're carrying freight in there, theological freight that's able to evoke into strength and faith. Like, some of the overriding themes, obviously, if we look at it carefully, are that God creates the world good, and that's a profound statement. It was particularly profound at the time it was in the oral and the written traditions, where that was being denied, that we were into a very negative state. And I think perhaps important for us to hear today also, the fact that the Sabbath, the seventh day, is the day of rest. It was from that context of the priestly writers, it could question the people and say, if Yahweh can rest on the seventh day, how about you, O Israel? Shouldn't you be observing the Sabbath? And the pinnacle of creation there is humankind. It's the most important. And humankind is then to be responsible for, is to be the conserver of all of God's creation. But if I get caught on the framework, even a child teaching elementary school are going to pick it up in the early grades already, that the sun appears after light. That if I'm not prepared for a kind of poetic form, I'm going to be in difficulty if I think I'm dealing with 20th century history at that point.
Yes, the problem's going to arise very early. That's right. So the actual light is created before the sun, and people would have a problem with that.
Yeah.
I was thinking too of the story of the garden and so on. The Adam and Eve in the garden. The word Adam in Hebrew is the generic word for ha-adam, for mankind as a whole. So Adam in that way really becomes sort of representative of all of us. And we are Adam in a sense. I mean, we got the same kinds of problems. We're in a position of needing to submit to God. Yeah. So in that would help us. And I think the serpent, isn't it the case that Israel had neighbors who were into serpent worship? And so it's really quite a clever put down by the author to make the tempter, the devil figure, to be the serpent and cast him in the bad light, and thereby to show the ridiculous character of some of the religious practices of their neighbors.
The more I can enable myself to get into the background, Jim, like you're suggesting, I'm going to see that there is so many times a polemic behind the writings. Like the message is not only directed to build up faith, it's also to put down the practice of a neighboring religion that seems to be really drawing so many of the Israelites to itself. And as you indicate, that that once again is very clever, to put the object of worship in the position of the one who is really deceiving the woman in this instance, and ultimately the man.
That knowing a bit of the history of Israel really helps, doesn't it, in locating all this. The numbers that come to my mind are just as memory pegs. To date Abraham something around 1900 B.C., about as far before Christ as we live. Abraham, the father of the Hebrew people, father of faith. And then the next event that seems big is the Exodus event, 1250, with Moses, 1250 years before Christ, taking the Israelites out of Egypt. Now that one we have pretty close, don't we? Because we have Egyptian records to help us to know that. I notice in your own work you date King David at 1000 B.C., which is an easy one to remember.
Right.
And then you have the period of the fall of the northern kingdom in 721,
Right.
fall of the south, which is Judah, Jerusalem, which is even more important, connected with the prophet Isaiah and all that, in 586, return from exile in 539. Well, knowing those kinds of dates, I mean, I don't suppose people are all going to remember that kind of thing, but it does give a framework. So we got this, when they start constructing the story about Genesis now, that we get in Genesis 1 to 11, I think we get our early versions of it in the oral period while they're repeating the stories, and then my own recollection is that it gets written down somewhere during the time of Solomon, or in the kings there, around 900 and some B.C., and then it gets its final form only around, in the 5th century or the 500s, somewhere around there. So that this business that we're talking about, Genesis 1 to 11, which is talking about the beginning of our world, which really goes back, science tells us, 5 billion years, which again is something that really can't be doubted very much through the radiocarbon dating process and so on, and our own existence as human beings over a couple million years ago. So we're not talking about something that's handed down year after year, all these millions of years, but we're talking about constructed stories that get done there somewhere around the year 1000 B.C. down to the year 500 or so, while it's being told orally and put into different forms and so on. And the form we've got then, as we read it in our Bibles, would come something like 400 or 500 years before Christ, right?
That's right. And we're into then looking at the Bible from certain particular viewpoints or from certain perspectives. That's perhaps an important thing for me to try to achieve, that I can begin to see that so much of the narrative of Scripture is written from a particular point of view. Like, I can see this if I allow myself the time when I'm looking at writings that are written by the priestly class, writings, say, 6th, 5th, 4th century, before the time of Jesus, that the preoccupation, the concerns are very much to do with cult, with ritual, with worship. And I can see that also with the position of the priest. Like Aaron is singled out. There's you'll find in so many of the accounts in Numbers, there's a great preponderance of detail about clothing, about law in particular.
And so your presupposition that the priests have written this because that is their own interest and preoccupation.
That's right. Whereas the preoccupation of the other levels is going to be somewhat different. The Yahwist is going to be even speaking of God in anthropomorphic or human-like terms, where he...
And when you say Yahwist, you mean the one who wrote originally there in the 10th century B.C.
That's
and
right.
wrote down a big part of what we know as the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, right?
Right, and we refer to him as the Yahwist because most often he calls God Yahweh, and that's one way for us then to tag him. The German used the J, the Jahwe, so we've retained that. So
we call that the J tradition.
That's right.
And you read that, we keep talking about Genesis 1 to 11, and so his work makes up a big part of that, right? Is it the 2nd chapter of Genesis?
That's right, that's right. Start with the priestly and then the Yahwist. That's what we're talking about now, is a hypothesis that has been challenged over the last 100 years and has the flickers of genius in it. Like, scholars, even 200, 300 years ago, were looking at these same texts we're talking about and were beginning to see discrepancies. They were wondering about why repetitions, why duplications and things like that.
Why Yahweh, the God, was called by two different names. One
Yahweh,
place Yahweh
yeah.
and another one Elohim.
That's right. And those ultimately got to be clues for those people. With those bits of genius, ultimately a man just about 100 years ago by the name of Julius Wellhausen could begin to pull it together into a kind of a synthesis. And it's been challenged, but pretty well it's stood. It doesn't answer everything, but he's given us then four sources, four traditions that ultimately the priestly writer that you're indicating writes about the 6th, 5th, 4th century could pull together. It's as if he was handed those traditions and could rework them then. His is the sequence, and his is a strong impact on the entire of the Old Testament, the entire of the Tanakh. And that's helpful for me when I become comfortable with that, to recognize that in Deuteronomy I've got a particular perspective that very few of the kings are going to be good men, especially the kings from the north are not going to be good.
They're going to always put them in a bad light, even if they were fairly good people.
That's right.
So, Gene, what we've got here is this fellow Wellhausen back at the turn of the century sort of putting together this theory that when we're looking at the Hebrew Scriptures, or what we call the Old Testament, there's really four distinct traditions found in the first part of it, in the Pentateuch, the first 5 or 6 books, or more, including the Book of Kings, too, right? Joshua and Judges,
right.
1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So in there we've got these 4 different traditions woven together that were repeated orally and then at some point got written down, and some fellow, the priestly editor as we call him, way back in the maybe 500s or so, ended up getting this down in the form that we know it. Now that bit of scholarly information, I suppose, all is connecting in again with our suggestion that it will help us understand the Bible better and avoid problems. That helps us, I guess, get the background to this notion of literary forms, that the Bible's written in different forms, and would have that one very practical consequence today, at least, of saying we don't have to feel there's a fight between being scientifically with it and holding what the Bible teaches. I'm always interested in making sure that we don't just do scholarship for the sake of doing it, but that it has to have a bearing. So if someone's going to sit down and read their Bible right now, it will evidently help them to, when they're reading Genesis 1 to 11, to know that they're not dealing with a stenographic report or somebody walking around the garden behind Adam and Eve with a notebook and getting it all down, nor a tradition that's handed on over millions of years, but rather a poetic effort by authors throughout a 500-year period to understand who we are, who we humans are, and how we relate to our God. And I like the point you made before about that one of the major things was that creation is good, that there's a fundamental goodness. I like that God looks down after he made something and says, well, that's good. And isn't it when he looks down on the creation of human beings, says that's very good. And that would be a tremendous help to people who are feeling bad about themselves or having poor self-images, and to realize that there's an essential goodness about all of us humans. So what we're saying is to know this one simple fact about literary form would enable us to read Genesis 1 to 11 in a better way. We wouldn't really, if we did that, we wouldn't be expecting him to find an ark on top of the mountain. What is it, Mount Ararat?
That's right.
That we really are not expecting him to find an ark. We don't have to be worried about how he got 2 of every kind of species on board that boat. But we realize we're dealing with a flood story, a legend common to the author that he made use of, in fact, a couple of flood stories probably, that he put together, again, to teach us religious truths.
That's right. We're dealing with a theologian then, ultimately.
That's right.
Or
a man
an imparter of faith.
Talking about the relationship between God and man.
Exactly.
That's one of the things, again, the scientific world kicked that off, right? Archaeology found other flood stories, correct?
Right.
That then some people said, aha, what's in the Bible isn't true, because these other Akkadian stories and so on were written before our story. But what we understand now is that the author made use of this legendary material to teach his lesson. He put it into a framework of his faith.
That's an important point, Jim, that the author could actually borrow stories. He saw that it was a powerful story, and he could adapt that to fit into Israel's faith perspective and use that. He felt comfortable in doing that. We know some of the Psalms also were products of neighbors, and they were changed. Yahweh was put in the central position, and Israel didn't fear to use those things.
Well, we've talked a lot about this first part of Genesis being a particular literary form, legendary, poetic, and so on. But we must remember that isn't true for the whole of the Scriptures, right? So we have some things that are extremely historical. David and Solomon, which we have solid evidence for from archaeology. We can date them and so on. Isaiah, certainly a clear historical figure. And we have other parts that are more poetic. So, I mean, when people sometimes hear this, they get upset and they think, well, you're throwing out all the Scriptures, or that literary forms mean it's all made up. And that really isn't true. There's a solid historical core. We know that the Exodus occurred. Someone said we'd have to invent Moses if we didn't have him. We know that Saul and David and Solomon were the kings. We know the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah existed. And so there is a solid historical core that we can date, and we know what is going on with that. And once that is clear to us, I think maybe people won't get so upset when they hear about this other notion of literary forms. I feel it's a great help to us, that if we understand that much, it will avoid a lot of difficulties, and on the other hand, it will help us to read the Scriptures much more fruitfully.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Eugene Trester, professor at St. Michael's College, University of Toronto. The topic of this week's Reflections was literary form in the Bible. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.